60,000 hooves thundered across the endless plains of the Eurasian steppe. 4 days, dust hung over the horizon like smoke from a dying world. Entire tribes Kipchaks, Cumans, Tatars were swallowed in fire as the Mongol horde swept west. Villages burned to ash. Rivers ran thick with silt and blood. And among the countless captives dragged from the ruins of their homes, one boy would rise from bondage to carve his name into history. Baybars, the slave who would one day seize an empire. Welcome to Tale of History, where we explore the untold stories behind the rise and fall of the world's most powerful figures. If you're new here, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss the stories that time tried to silence. Because what began here, in the chaos of the steppe, didn't just forge a man, it reshaped the destiny of empires from the Nile to the Euphrates. Let's begin. At this time, the Mongol Empire was the terror of the earth. After burning Baghdad and crushing kingdoms from the Caspian to the Danube, the armies of Battle Khan pushed into the western steppes, lands ruled by the proud Kipchaks, a confederation of Turkic tribes who lived by the bow and the horse. Their strength lay in their speed. Their weakness was their unity, too scattered to resist a storm. The Mongols descended on them with fire. Entire clans vanished overnight. The survivors, women, children, and warriors too broken to fight, were chained together and sold like cattle to slave merchants. From the plains of the Don to the ports of the Black Sea, a new trade was booming, the traffic in human lives. The captives were herded into caravans bound for Crimea, where Genoese and Arab traders ran the markets of flesh. There, on a wooden platform beneath the hot southern sun, boys and girls were examined, priced, and sold. Strong arms, clear eyes, and silence fetched the highest value. One of them was the boy from the steppe, scarred, defiant, unbending even in chains. He was purchased by an Egyptian merchant for a handful of silver dinars and loaded onto a ship bound south across the Black Sea. What awaited him was not freedom but transformation. The boy was taken to Cairo, the beating heart of the Islamic world, where gold glittered in the mosques, the Nile shimmered beneath stone bridges, and the shadow of the citadel stretched like a warning across the city. Here, slaves like him were remade into soldiers. They were called Mamluk, a word meaning owned. Bought young, trained to fight, and sworn to loyalty, they became the professional warriors of sultans who trusted steel more than blood. Inside the barracks, the training was relentless. Boys were stripped of their old names, their languages, and their pasts. They learned to ride, to wield the sword, to recite scripture, and to obey without hesitation. Those who faltered vanished. Those who endured became something else entirely, men bred for war, conditioned to believe that obedience was salvation. Among them the steppe boy stood apart. His speed on horseback, his precision with the bow, his cold focus during combat all marked him as exceptional. Whispers spread among the trainers. This one is different. He was ruthless, patient, and silent, like a wolf waiting in tall grass. In a world built on servitude, he began to dream not of escape but of conquest. And from that dream would emerge one of the most formidable rulers the medieval world would ever know. The boy's name was Baybars. His story was born in chains, but it would end on a throne drenched in blood. In the heart of Cairo, behind high sandstone walls and iron-bound gates, the sound of steel never ceased. It was not the sound of battle, but of creation, the hammering rhythm by which men were unmade and rebuilt. This was the Mamluk barracks, the crucible of obedience, where flesh and spirit were burned and tempered until only loyalty remained. The air was thick with dust, sweat, and the faint tang of blood. Boys barely into their teens moved in tight ranks beneath the burning Egyptian sun, their voices rising in chorus as drill masters barked commands in a language many of them still barely understood. Each dawn began the same. The gates opened with a groan, and the new slaves were marched into the courtyard. Their heads were shaved, their clothes stripped, their past erased. They were told they no longer had fathers, mothers, or tribes, only Allah, the Sultan, and the blade. Disobedience meant pain, hesitation meant hunger. Faith was drilled into them as deeply as swordsmanship, so that every prayer was an act of control, every bow of the head a rehearsal for submission. You could hear the hierarchy in every footstep. Older recruits, junior emirs, watched from the shadows, measuring the new boys like hawks. They had survived the same process, endured the same degradation, and now enforced it with precision. It was a cycle without mercy, the broken forging the next generation of the broken. Baybars learned fast. He learned how to speak little and watch everything. He learned when to flinch and when to stand still, when the whip came faster for fear than for defiance. But even as his body hardened, something inside him refused to bow. There were moments, brief, dangerous moments, when his eyes met those of the trainers and held them a heartbeat too long. That look, quiet but unyielding, marked him out as a risk. They called him the wolf cub, half in mockery, half in fear. The instructors tried to crush it out of him. They doubled his drills, denied him water, forced him to hold his sword arm extended until his muscles screamed. He bore it in silence. When the others collapsed, he stayed upright, face blank, eyes fixed ahead as though daring the sun itself to move first. Scars gathered along his back and forearms, a ledger of defiance written in flesh. But with every mark his will grew sharper. He began to study the routines of his captors, the way they inspected armor, the angles of their strikes, the timing of their commands. What was meant to be obedience became observation, and what was meant to destroy him became education. At night, when the torches burned low and the desert wind whispered through the courtyard, Baybars practiced alone. He copied the older soldiers' forms until exhaustion blurred his vision. He carved patterns into the dirt with his feet, mock battlefields only he could see. Every motion was a promise. He would not remain a pawn forever. He would learn the language of power, and when the time came he would speak it fluently. Weeks turned to months, and the raw recruits were tested in contests meant to entertain their masters. Archery tournaments, dueling bouts, horse races across the open sand. The losers were beaten, sometimes worse. The winners earned scraps of food, praise, and the illusion of worth. In one such contest, Baybars' skill revealed itself. He rode a borrowed horse, an untamed beast known for throwing riders, and guided it through the obstacle course with effortless precision. When he loosed his final arrow, it struck dead center of the target, splitting the shaft of the arrow before it. The courtyard fell silent. Even the trainers paused, unsure whether to applaud or punish him for standing out too brightly. That moment changed everything. From then on, Baybars was not just another nameless recruit. He was watched by officers who saw potential, and by rivals who saw a threat. He was moved into advanced training, instructed in military tactics, formation maneuvers, and the recitation of command oaths. For the first time he saw the map of the world from the perspective of those who ruled it. Empires were not eternal, they were systems held together by fear, faith, and violence. If you mastered those, you mastered the world. Still, the process took its toll. He watched friends break under the strain, their spirits shattered until they became hollow vessels of obedience. He buried them in the desert when the officers were done with them, their graves marked only by the shape of the dunes. Each loss hardened him further. Each death whispered the same warning: survive or be erased. By the time Baybars came of age, the boy from the steppe was gone. In his place stood a soldier molded by pain, sharpened by discipline, and driven by something even the masters could not name. He had learned to kneel without surrender, to pray without believing, to obey without forgetting why he obeyed. His faith and his fury had fused into one purpose: to ascend beyond the reach of any whip. And deep within him, the wolf cub still waited, patient, silent, watching for the first crack in the cage. Because Baybars knew something his captors did not. Every empire that feeds on fear eventually starves on it. And when that day came, he would be ready to bite. If you can stomach this cruelty and still not honor the story with a subscription, perhaps you'd fit better among the masters than the slaves. Show some spine-joined tale of history, where the forgotten refused to stay silent. By the time Baybars earned the right to stand among the ranks of the Mamluk warriors, Egypt itself was trembling beneath the weight of its own fading glory. The Ayyubid dynasty, born from the legacy of Saladin the Great Unifier, the conqueror of Jerusalem, was now little more than a shadow of its former strength. The palace walls still glittered with gold, but inside those walls, fear had become the language of politics. Princes whispered behind curtains, viziers plotted in candlelight, and the sultans of Cairo ruled not with iron, but with suspicion. Outside the city, the people endured famine, taxes, and unrest. But within the fortress, the Mamluks thrived. What had once been a class of purchased slaves had become the real guardians of Egypt's power. They commanded its armies, patrolled its cities, guarded its palaces. The Ayyubid rulers depended on them the way a sick man depends on the medicine that will one day kill him. Every year, new recruits arrived, fresh captives bought from the steppes and the Caucasus, trained, hardened, and woven into this machine of control. By now, Baybars had risen above the barracks floor. He had proven himself in training, in command, and in discipline. The scars on his body were badges, the silence in his eyes, a weapon. He had learned the most dangerous truth of all, that fear, when mastered, becomes power. And that knowledge would soon be tested. The year was 1249. The Nile ran high with spring floodwaters, its surface shining like glass under the sun. But the calm of the river was a lie. Beyond Egypt's northern coast, ships filled with foreign banners were cutting through the waves. The Crusaders had returned. This time, it was not a few knights seeking glory or salvation. It was an army organized, determined, led by Louis IX of France, the so-called most Christian king. Their goal was not just to reclaim Jerusalem. They wanted Egypt, the beating heart of Islamic power, and through Egypt, domination of the entire Eastern world. When the alarm spread through Cairo, the Ayyubid court trembled. Ministers argued, commanders hesitated, and sultans prayed for miracles. But the Mamluks did not pray, they prepared. Among them rode Baybars, now a commander of men for the first time. He led his regiment south from Cairo, following the line of the Nile toward the coast. At every village, the peasants watched them pass in silence, soldiers armored in mail, faces hidden, voices hard. To the common folk, the Mamluks were both protectors and predators. To Baybars, they were the only family he had ever known. They reached Damietta, the port city that guarded the mouth of the Nile Delta. The Crusaders had already landed, stormed the walls, and taken the city with shocking ease. The Sultan's army fell back, leaving a trail of panic. It was here that Baybars saw the first test of his command, and the first proof of his nature. While other officers argued, he moved. He surveyed the terrain, the river currents, the narrow streets, and the old fortifications. He understood the simple truth of war, that whoever controlled the water controlled Egypt. And so, as the Crusaders advanced up the Nile, Baybars set a trap. He ordered his men to dismantle boats, drag them through the shallows, and rebuild them in ambush positions. When the enemy fleet passed, his archers rained death from both banks, and his cavalry struck from the reeds. The assault was sudden, brutal, and absolute. French knights fell into the mud, their armor turning to anchors as they drowned beneath the weight of their own glory. Those who tried to flee were cut down by curved blades flashing in the sunlight. It was said that the Nile ran red that day, the bodies drifting downstream like offerings to the river god of old. In that victory, Baybars proved himself more than a soldier, he was a strategist, a mind as sharp as the sword he carried. But even as the Sultan's banners rose over the captured enemy camp, Baybars felt no pride. The men he fought for, the rulers he defended, would never call him free. He was celebrated in whispers, not in proclamations. They praised his discipline, his cunning, his results, but behind the gilded doors of Cairo, they reminded one another that he was still a slave. A brilliant one, yes, but a slave nonetheless. Each battle widened the distance between Baybars and the world that owned him. Each order he obeyed reminded him that he could plan victories, save kingdoms, and still belong to another man's will. That realization did not break him, it focused him. Ambition grew quietly, like fire beneath sand. He began to study more than war, he studied people. He watched how the viziers flattered their masters, how the emirs shifted alliances, how the sultans pretended to rule while their guards made the real decisions. He saw the weaknesses, the insecurities, the dependencies. And he understood that the throne was not unreachable, it was merely occupied. As months passed, his reputation spread among the ranks. Soldiers followed his commands without question. Officers noted his precision, his calm in the chaos of battle, his uncanny instinct for reading terrain and men alike. He began to attract loyalty not to the Sultan but to himself. In the corridors of power, his name carried both admiration and fear. Some called him the Lion of the North, others more quietly the shadow of the throne. And yet, beneath the surface of triumph, the psychological toll deepened. Baybars knew that he fought for rulers who despised him even as they depended on him. He had saved their crown, yet he could not wear it. He had defended their land, yet he owned no grain of its soil. At night, when the city slept, he would stand at the edge of the citadel walls and look toward the desert, the wind lifting the edge of his cloak like the memory of freedom. The steppe was gone. The chains had changed shape, but they had never fallen away. In this contradiction between the master's trust and the slave's truth, the future began to form. The soldier who fought for others was learning how to fight for himself. The commander who obeyed was learning how to rule. And in the stillness of the barracks, where the moonlight struck his sword like a whisper, Baybars began to see the outline of the empire he would one day claim. Because every empire, before it falls, creates its own destroyer. And Egypt, in its weakness, had already forged his name. If you've listened to this far through the hunger, the chains, and the fire of the Nile, and still haven't subscribed, then maybe the silence of history is what you deserve. But if you feel the weight of these forgotten stories, prove it. Subscribe to Tale of History, where the ghosts of power never rest. When the end of the world came, it came from the east. Not as prophecy, not as plague, but as men riders of the steppe, born of smoke and iron. The Mongols. Their legend spread faster than their armies. They were said to drink blood, to build pyramids of skulls, to slaughter without word or mercy. Cities that heard their hoofbeats did not prepare to fight, they prepared to die. And in the year 1258, that legend reached its crescendo. Baghdad, the jewel of the Islamic world, the city of caliphs and scholars, the beacon of art and knowledge fell. For 500 years, it had been the heart of civilization, where astronomers mapped the heavens and poets mapped the soul. Now its libraries burned for 7 days. The Tigris ran black with the ink of books and red with the blood of its people. The last Abbasid caliph al-Mustasim was trampled to death beneath the hooves of horses. The house of wisdom became a grave. And from that grave rose a single message to the world. No empire is safe. The news reached Cairo like thunder. Merchants whispered it through the bazaars, imams spoke of it in trembling sermons, and soldiers in the Mamluk barracks sharpened their blades with new purpose. The Mongols had crossed the Euphrates. They had taken Aleppo, Damascus, and were now pushing toward the Sinai. The Islamic heartlands Egypt, Syria, Arabia, stood on the edge of annihilation. Panic ruled the streets. Some said it was the punishment of God, that the sins of sultans had summoned divine wrath. Others believed it was the end of days foretold in Hadith, a people of the East with faces like shields and eyes like demons. Even the scholars, once so proud, began to flee south, carrying with them the shattered remnants of what was once the civilized world. In Cairo, the Ayyubid dynasty was gone. Its kings had fallen into greed and weakness, undone by the very guards they had created to protect them. The Mamluks, those once enslaved soldiers, now stood as Egypt's only wall against the storm. And among them the most feared name was Baybars. He had seen the Mongols before years ago on the steppe, when he was still a boy in chains. He remembered the burning villages, the screams, the unrelenting thunder of their advance. He knew their power better than any man in Cairo, and that knowledge burned in him like prophecy. The world that had enslaved him was now on its knees. The old dynasty's caliphs, sultans, empires were dying. And in their death throes he saw an opening. But even Baybars knew one man alone could not stand against the Mongol tide. Egypt needed unity, not ambition. And unity came from an unlikely source, Sultan Qutuz. Qutuz too was a Mamluk by birth, once a captive now a ruler. He was pragmatic, disciplined, and ruthless enough to understand that politics could no longer be a luxury. If Egypt fell, Islam itself might follow. Under his leadership, Cairo began to breathe again. Messengers rode across the deserts, summoning the armies of Syria, Palestine, and the Delta. The call to arms echoed through mosques and marketplaces alike. Every sword, every horse, every ounce of loyalty was demanded. And Baybars, the general without chains but still without title, was called to serve. It was an uneasy alliance. Qutuz was the sultan by law, Baybars was the warrior by will. Each needed the other but neither trusted him. Qutuz saw in Baybars a brilliant mind wrapped in quiet defiance. Baybars saw in Qutuz another master who had forgotten where he came from. But necessity is a stronger bond than affection. Together, they began to prepare the army that would face the impossible. Cairo transformed. The smithies burned through the night, hammers clanging in rhythm to the pulse of fear. Mosques overflowed with soldiers praying for victory or forgiveness, sometimes both. Children watched from rooftops as regiments of Mamluks marched beneath banners of black and gold. The Nile, eternal witness to the rise and fall of dynasties, carried their reflections like omens downstream. As the army gathered, Baybars took command of the vanguard. He drilled his men relentlessly, not out of duty but out of memory. He taught them how to face cavalry charges without breaking, how to fight in tight formations against riders who struck like lightning and vanished like ghosts. He spoke little, but when he did, his words cut deeper than any sword. He told them that the Mongols could kill their bodies, but only cowardice could kill their names. Far to the north, the Mongol general Kipchak, a veteran of countless conquests, led his army into Syria. Behind him marched tens of thousands Mongols, Armenians, Georgians, and local auxiliaries who believed resistance was hopeless. They swept through Aleppo with fire and terror, leaving nothing but silence. Those who survived fled south toward Egypt, carrying the last warning the region would ever hear. The storm had reached the gates. Qutuz and Baybars met in Damascus, the city of prophets, now a refugee camp of the defeated. The two men stood in the great Umayyad Mosque, surrounded by the smoke of burning homes and the weeping of widows. They understood what no one else dared to say aloud. This was not just another invasion. It was the death of the old world. And if they failed, Egypt would burn as Baghdad had burned. Together they began the march north, through the desert, across the Jordan, toward the valley of Ain Jalut. The soldiers whispered that they were walking into legend, into a battle foretold since the beginning of time. Baybars rode at the front, eyes fixed on the horizon, the same horizon he had once crossed as a captive. Now he crossed it as a commander. The Mongols were waiting, confident, ruthless, undefeated. Their banners rippled in the wind like dark wings. And as the two armies drew near, the earth seemed to hold its breath. Baybars knew what had to be done. The Mongols had never known defeat. They fought with arrogance born of invincibility. To break them he would need more than strength, he would need deception, precision, and the one weapon they could not understand: patience. And so, the stage was set, not just for battle but for judgment. For the first time in history, the unstoppable would meet the unbreakable. The storm from the east had reached its limit. And waiting in its path was a man who had spent his whole life preparing to meet it. You've stood in the ashes of Baghdad, you've marched beside Baybars through the shadow of extinction, and still you hesitate to subscribe? Maybe you belong among the forgotten. But if you refuse to turn away when history burns brightest, then join Tale of History, where the rise and ruin of empires are never silenced. Dawn rose over the valley of Ain Jalut, a quiet stretch of green trapped between the hills of Galilee. The wind moved through the grass like breath through lungs, and for a fleeting moment the world seemed calm. But that calm was a lie. Beneath the mist, two worlds were converging, one born of iron discipline, the other of unbroken conquest. The Mamluks of Egypt stood waiting in silence, their banners heavy with dew, their armor glinting faintly in the rising sun. And across the plain, like a tide of steel, came the Mongols. For more than half a century, no army had stopped them. They had torn through Persia, devoured Baghdad, trampled the Levant, and now they came for Egypt, the last wall between civilization and the void. Their horses were lean, their bows short and deadly, their movements precise and predatory. Every man in their ranks had killed to survive. They were ghosts of the steppe, unshaken by prayer, unburdened by mercy. At their head rode Kipchak, a general whose very name was enough to empty villages before he arrived. He carried the arrogance of the unconquered, the certainty that the world was already his. Baybars watched them from the ridge. To the men beside him, he looked carved from stone. But behind his stillness was calculation. He had chosen this ground carefully, a narrow plain hemmed by hills, where the Mongols could not maneuver freely. The grass concealed his cavalry, the gullies hid his archers. Every fold of the earth was a weapon waiting to be drawn. He had studied the Mongols' rhythm, the way they advanced, the timing of their charges, the confidence of men who had never known retreat. And he intended to use that confidence to destroy them. The Mamluks numbered perhaps 20,000. The Mongols, around 25,000 strong, hardened veterans of countless campaigns. Outnumbered or not, Baybars knew numbers meant little. War was not decided by strength but by understanding of terrain, of timing, of fear. At his signal, drums rolled through the valley. A low, steady heartbeat. The Mongols advanced, their lines spreading wide, horse archers readying their bows. Arrows darkened the air, a hiss like rain before a storm. The Mamluk front staggered but held, shields rising, ranks locking together in perfect unison. Behind them, Baybars whispered a single order: wait. When the Mongols struck again, Baybars unleashed his counter-archers. They rose from behind the dunes and sent a cloud of arrows slicing into the enemy's flanks. The valley became a maelstrom of dust and screams. Steel clashed. Horses reared. The sun climbed higher and the battlefield turned into a furnace. Kipchak pressed harder. He was too seasoned to fear ambush, too proud to imagine defeat. He ordered his elite riders to crush the Mamluk center. Baybars allowed it. He gave the appearance of faltering, a step backward here, a scattered formation there, and then deliberately he ordered the impossible: retreat. The Mamluk front began to withdraw in measured panic, pulling the Mongols deeper into the valley. To Kipchak it looked like collapse. To Baybars it was the tightening of a snare. The Mongols roared, pursuing the fleeing enemy with all their fury. They surged forward, horses foaming, banners streaming straight into the narrow choke point between the hills. And then from the ridges the traps snapped shut. Hidden Mamluk cavalry poured down from both sides, screaming the takbir, the cry of faith that shook the air itself. Arrows rained from the slopes, lances thrust from every direction. The Mongols, trapped and disoriented, tried to wheel around but the valley betrayed them. Their famous mobility, their greatest strength, was useless in that confined ground. For the first time in memory their formation broke. Baybars drove into the chaos personally, his sword flashing like a spark in the dust. He cut through riders as though striking at ghosts of his past, every Mongol that fell another fragment of the boy he had once been. Blood mingled with sweat, the earth drank deeply. He fought not as a man defending a kingdom, but as a slave avenging a world. Hours passed. The screams of men merged with the roar of the wind. When Kipchak realized he was surrounded, he refused to flee. He fought until his horse was cut from under him, until he was dragged to the ground and taken alive. They brought him before Qutuz, still defiant, still unbroken. When the Sultan asked him why he had destroyed so much of the world, Kipchak laughed and answered, "Because it was the will of heaven." Qutuz replied only, "And today heaven has chosen otherwise." Moments later, the Mongol general was executed, his head displayed on a spear before his army. The Mongol lines collapsed. Their survivors fled north, hunted down and scattered into the desert. The steppes' thunder had been silenced, its rhythm broken for the first time. And when the dust finally settled over Ain Jalut, the valley was littered with the wreckage of two empires' pride. For the Islamic world it was deliverance. For Baybars it was revelation. He had stood against the force that had once enslaved him and triumphed. Yet even as songs of victory spread through the camps, he felt the familiar weight of invisible chains. The glory belonged to Qutuz, the throne to another. He was still a servant, a commander who would kneel while others took credit for the world he had saved. That night, under a bruised sky and the stench of death, Baybars washed his sword in the stream that had once run clear. He looked down at the reflection in the blood-stained water, a face hardened by triumph and resentment. He had delivered Egypt from extinction, and still the taste of servitude lingered. Something in him shifted that night, quietly, permanently. The man who had fought for a master was gone. What remained was a ruler waiting for his moment. Ain Jalut was not the end of his war. It was the beginning of his empire. You've watched the unstoppable fall and the unbreakable rise. If you can sit through the roar of Ain Jalut and still leave without subscribing, then maybe history itself no longer moves you. But if this victory sent a chill through your spine, prove it. Join Tale of History where every battle still echoes. The victory at Ain Jalut echoed across continents. From the deserts of Arabia to the markets of Damascus, the word spread like wildfire. The Mongols had been stopped. For the first time in living memory, their march of terror had met its end, not in retreat but in ruin. And in the center of that storm stood two men, Qutuz, the Sultan who claimed the triumph, and Baybars, the commander who had made it possible. Cairo rejoiced. Mosques overflowed with prayers, poets sang of divine mercy, and the people hailed Qutuz as the savior of Islam. But behind the curtains of celebration, the victors walked in silence. For the soldiers who had fought under Baybars, the songs rang hollow. They knew whose mind had turned chaos into victory. They knew whose hands had shaped the impossible into fact. The lion had won the battle, but another wore its crown. In the days that followed, the Mamluk army began its slow journey back to Egypt. The air was heavy with triumph, but within that triumph was tension. Qutuz was sultan by title, yet Baybars commanded the loyalty of the warriors, the men who had bled beside him. And Qutuz knew it. He saw in Baybars what all rulers fear most, a subject too capable to be controlled. At first, the unease was quiet, subtle glances, unspoken words. But power is a fragile thing. It feeds on gratitude for only a moment before turning to fear. And fear whispers faster than truth. Rumors began to move through the camp, that Qutuz had promised Baybars rewards, land, command, and that each promise had vanished into silence. Some said it was pride, others said it was politics. But Baybars saw only betrayal. He had fought the invincible. He had led men through hell. And now he was expected to kneel again, to watch another man take the glory, another master reap the fruit of his pain. The same pattern reborn in finer robes. As the army marched across the plains of Palestine, the heat pressed down like a curse. The Nile was still weeks away, the roads lined with exhausted soldiers, their armor dulled by dust. In the evenings, when the campfires flickered under the desert wind, Baybars withdrew to the edge of the camp. He said little. But his silence drew others, Mamluks who owed him loyalty, officers who had seen what he could do, men who had begun to whisper that Egypt deserved a different ruler. One night, beneath a moon the color of old bone, a decision was made. The plan was simple, swift, final. As the army approached the town of Salahiyah, Qutuz rode ahead to hunt gazelles. He was surrounded by his trusted emirs, or so he believed. Among them rode Baybars, calm, quiet, unreadable. They moved into the desert, away from the main force, the heat shimmering over the sand. When the Sultan loosed an arrow and turned to speak, Baybars struck. One blow fast, decisive, the culmination of years of obedience turned inward like a blade. Kutuz fell from his horse, blood soaking the sand. The others watched, frozen, as Baybars wiped the blade and whispered the words that ended one reign and began another. There was no trial, no proclamation. Only the sound of wind moving across the dunes. A sultan had died and a slave had killed him. When they returned to camp, the army gathered in silence. They saw Kutuz's lifeless body and Baybars standing above it, the sun behind him, the sand red beneath his feet. He did not beg their loyalty. He did not ask for permission. He simply looked at them, the men who had fought, starved and bled beside him, and said, "Egypt cannot wait for the weak." That was enough. They hailed him Al-Malik al-Zahir Baybars, the victorious king. The crown was not placed on his head by ceremony or consent. It was forged in betrayal, tempered by necessity and baptized in blood. When the army finally reached Cairo, the city did not resist. Its rulers had changed many times before, but never like this. This was no royal succession, no dynastic claim. This was the rule of the blade, the birth of a new order. The gates opened to him as if compelled by fear itself. Baybars rode through them not as a servant, not as a savior, but as something more dangerous. A man who had broken the chain between master and slave. In the citadel, beneath the towering walls that once held him captive, Baybars ascended the throne. The marble floor still carried the echoes of his years of obedience. Now those echoes belonged to him. He ruled not by inheritance but by conquest, not by birthright but by blood. Outside, the city hummed with uncertainty. Was this divine justice, a slave chosen by God to rule the proud? Or was it the beginning of yet another tyranny, born from vengeance disguised as destiny? Even Baybars did not know the answer. He only knew that survival was no longer enough. The boy from the steppe had reached the summit of power. And from the summit, there is only one direction left to fall. You've witnessed rebellion cloaked in righteousness, and murder disguised as destiny. If that doesn't stir you, then perhaps power itself has numbed you. But if you still believe history should be faced not flattered, then subscribe to Tale of History, where truth wears no crown and no king dies innocent. The throne of Cairo had always been a place of illusion, a gilded cage built from conquest, where every ruler sat haunted by the ghosts of those who came before. But when Baybars al-Bunduktari ascended that throne, the illusion shattered. The slave who had once polished the armor of sultans now wore the crown himself. And with it came the burden of proving that fear could rule where bloodlines had failed. The first days of his reign were soaked in silence. Cairo did not cheer. It watched. The markets continued to hum, the mosques to echo with prayer, but behind every whisper was the same question. How long before this new king is devoured by the same machine that made him? Baybars understood that question better than anyone. He had risen by the sword, and he knew it would always hang above him. So he turned his paranoia into policy, his suspicion into strategy. He began to build a system that would see everything, know everything, and trust no one. He moved swiftly. The Mamluk army, once fractured by rival loyalties, was purged and reorganized under his direct command. No officer held a regiment without his approval. No emir commanded loyalty higher than the throne. Every soldier knew, the man they served was not just their ruler, but their reflection. They too had been slaves, now they served the only one who had escaped that fate. It made them loyal in a way gold could never buy, and dangerous in a way power could never contain. Then came the heart of his genius, control through communication. Baybars built the most advanced postal and intelligence system the medieval world had ever seen. From the Libyan coast to the mountains of Armenia, a network of mounted couriers galloped day and night, carrying sealed orders, coded letters, and reports of every whisper, every rumor, every betrayal. Pigeons carried messages faster than caravans. Spies listened from pulpits and taverns alike. No man in Egypt could conspire without his shadow hearing it first. What had once been a kingdom of chaos became a web of surveillance. He ruled through the quiet fear of being seen. But Baybars knew that no empire survives on fear alone. Tyranny without faith is just another rebellion waiting to happen. So he wrapped his rule in the fabric of piety. He rebuilt mosques, restored shrines, and ordered the construction of new madrasas, schools where scholars and imams preached his name alongside the verses of God. The walls of Cairo rose higher, adorned with inscriptions praising justice, discipline, and divine order. But behind every calligraphic verse was the silent presence of his spies. His mosques were sanctuaries and listening posts alike. To the people, he appeared as the righteous defender of Islam, the warrior king who had saved them from the Mongols and the Crusaders. He prayed in public, fasted during Ramadan, and funded pilgrimages to Mecca. But his faith was not of the heart, it was of the state. He understood what centuries of rulers had forgotten, that religion, when wielded with precision, could be sharper than any blade. The crowning jewel of this illusion came with a single stroke of political theater. Baghdad was gone, its caliphate extinguished beneath Mongol hooves. The Muslim world was leaderless, its moral axis shattered. Baybars saw an opportunity. He summoned a surviving member of the Abbasid family, one of the few who had escaped the slaughter in Baghdad. The man arrived in Cairo half prince, half refugee. Baybars received him with reverence, clothed him in royal robes, and proclaimed before the scholars of Al-Azhar, "The caliphate is reborn, under the protection of Egypt." In truth, the new caliph was nothing more than a puppet. A symbol resurrected to bless Baybars' power with divine legitimacy. The sermons of Friday prayer carried both their names, the caliphs for heaven, the sultans for earth. The people believed Islam had been restored. In reality it had been rewritten. And yet, Baybars was not content to rule with parchment and prayer alone. He built fortresses that still scar the landscape of the Middle East, Qalat al-Jabal in Cairo, Qalat al-Rabah, and others across the Syrian frontier. Each fortress was a message to his enemies, that Egypt's borders were walls of stone and will. He fortified the coasts against Crusader raids, rebuilt naval fleets, and stationed garrisons in the deserts that had once hidden thieves and rebels. Under his reign, Egypt became not just a kingdom, but a machine, an empire that watched, listened, and struck before its enemies could even rise. To his subjects, Baybars was Al-Zahir, the victorious, the manifest. To his enemies he was a shadow that spoke in thunder. He crushed revolts with surgical precision, sent assassins across borders, and turned diplomacy into a weapon sharper than any sword. Every neighboring ruler feared his messengers more than his armies, because a letter from Baybars could mean alliance today and invasion tomorrow. But beneath the grandeur, his rule was not peace, it was control. He demanded absolute obedience, not through love but through inevitability. Every subject knew the truth whispered in Cairo's alleys: to defy Baybars was to vanish. He had become what the Mongols had been to the world: unstoppable, unknowable, absolute. And yet, in the stillness of the palace he built, surrounded by the gold of victory and the incense of prayer, Baybars often stood alone. He had remade the empire that once enslaved him, but the freedom he sought had turned into a new kind of prison. To stay alive he had to rule. To rule he had to be feared. And fear, once unleashed, consumes even its master. In that paradox, his legend took root: a ruler who ruled through terror yet was remembered as a savior, a tyrant who restored faith while draining it of soul. He was the fusion of sword and scripture, the perfect symbol of a world too tired for ideals and too afraid for chaos. The Lion of Egypt had roared, and the world had fallen silent. But silence in history never lasts. The same wind that carries the scent of victory also carries the seeds of rebellion. And beyond Egypt's golden walls, old enemies stirred, waiting for the day when even lions grow old. You've just walked through an empire built from chains and prayer, ruled by a man who turned fear into law and faith into armor. If you can listen to that and still not subscribe, maybe you too would have stood silent under his throne. Prove otherwise, subscribe to Tale of History, where the lions of the past still breathe through the dust of empires. The year was 1268, and the Mediterranean once again trembled with the echo of war drums. To the west, in the castles of Acre and Tripoli, Crusader lords prayed to a god who had long since stopped answering. To the east, from the deserts of Egypt, rode a man who had made his name the measure of fear: Sultan Al-Zahir Baybars, the Lion of Egypt. The Mongols had been broken. The caliphate had been reborn under his banner. And now, only one enemy remained: the remnants of the Crusader states, those stubborn western enclaves clinging to the bones of a world that was already dead. For nearly 2 centuries, the cross and the crescent had traded blood for sand across the Holy Land. But by the time Baybars turned his gaze north, the crusading dream had decayed into mercantile greed and fragile pride. Antioch, Tripoli, and Acre, jewels once shining with Christian power, had become fractured outposts, ruled by men more interested in gold than God. They survived only through treaties and hesitation, through the illusion that the East had grown weary of war. But Baybars had not grown weary. He had grown patient. He saw in the Crusader fortresses what he saw in all decaying empires: weakness disguised as faith. Their walls were thick, yes, but their hearts were hollow. Their knights wore polished armor, yet their ranks were thin, their loyalty divided. And so, in the 3rd decade of his reign, Baybars declared a holy war, not of conversion but of extinction. The campaign began with Tripoli. His forces swept across the coast like locusts, dismantling every watchtower and stronghold that dared bear the sign of the cross. The Mamluk cavalry moved with mechanical precision, cutting off supply routes, poisoning wells, and surrounding cities until their defenders starved. Each victory was marked not by celebration, but by silence, the kind of silence that comes after complete annihilation. Villages vanished, fortresses burned, and crosses were torn from their steeples to be melted into coins of victory. But Baybars' true vengeance fell upon Antioch, one of the oldest Crusader capitals, once the beating heart of Christendom in the east. By the time he reached its walls, Antioch had grown weak, ruled by Bohemond VI, a prince whose pride outlived his power. Baybars surrounded the city with precision, encampments stretching for miles, catapults and siege towers glinting under the Levantine sun. He did not rush the attack, he wanted the terror to grow roots. He sent letters to Bohemond not as a conqueror but as a poet of dread. In one message preserved by chroniclers, Baybars wrote, "Had you been here to see your people crying beneath our swords, you would know what vengeance looks like when patience has ended. The sky itself has turned against you, and the angels no longer understand your prayers." Bohemond was not even in Antioch. He had fled to Tripoli, leaving his city to face the storm alone. And when Baybars' engines began to strike, the earth shook as if judgment itself had come. The siege lasted only 4 days. Antioch, once the proud citadel of the Crusader kingdom, fell with scarcely a whisper of resistance. The slaughter that followed was methodical. The gates were barred, the streets sealed. Baybars gave no order for mercy, no room for negotiation. Every man of fighting age was killed. Women and children were taken as slaves, marched away in chains to be scattered across the markets of Cairo and Damascus. The city that had once hosted kings and bishops was emptied of life. Baybars entered its cathedrals and ordered the bells torn down, the icons smashed, the altars purified with blood. He wrote again to Bohemond after the victory. "If you had been in Antioch today, you would have wished to be anywhere else in creation. Your city is gone. Your people are gone. Even your God did not come." To his followers this was justice. To his enemies, it was horror without measure. Western chroniclers would later describe him as a beast in the body of a man. A ruler who waged war not only against armies but against the idea of resistance itself. They spoke of how his soldiers piled the skulls of the dead at the city gates, how the rivers ran red for days, how the stench of burning flesh carried for miles. But in Cairo the mosques rang with praise. The preachers declared that God had avenged the centuries of humiliation, that the Holy Land had been cleansed of invaders, that Baybars, the slave of yesterday, had become the hammer of the infidel today. He did not stop at Antioch. From there he marched south to Jaffa, Safed, Arsuf, and the coastal fortresses that dotted the Levant like dying embers. Each fell in turn. He offered terms of surrender, but those who accepted were enslaved, those who resisted were erased. The pattern repeated until only Acre, the last bastion of the Crusaders, still stood. And even there Baybars did not attack at once. He preferred to let fear rot its defenders from within. He wrote to its rulers not to negotiate, but to remind them of what they had seen. The smoke of Antioch, the silence of Tripoli, the endless funerals of a faith that had lost its courage. Under Baybars' reign, total war became doctrine. He fought not just to win, but to erase, to make sure that no trace of the Crusader dream would ever return to plague the East. He turned conquest into ritual, vengeance into administration. His victories were announced with sermons, his massacres cloaked in scripture. He was the perfect synthesis of warrior and cleric, of sword and sermon. He ruled the battlefield with fire and the pulpit with fear. And yet, in this reign of triumph, his humanity grew thinner, his compassion buried under the weight of purpose. He had become the very force he once fought to survive, relentless, merciless, unbound by pity. His enemies called him a monster, but his people called him protector. In truth he was neither. He was simply the reflection of the age itself, an age where the only morality left was victory. When Antioch burned, a chapter of the Crusades closed forever. The cross, once planted proudly in the soil of the Levant, was uprooted and cast into the sea. And in its place stood the crescent standard of Baybars, gleaming under the same sun that had once witnessed his chains. The slave had conquered his masters. The hunted had become the hunter. And as the smoke of the Crusader cities drifted into the heavens, Baybars stood in the ashes and whispered to no one, "Let them call me beast. Even beasts are free." By the time the fires of Antioch dimmed, Baybars had already moved beyond conquest. War was no longer the tool, it was the shadow cast by something far greater: control. He had learned that victory on the battlefield was fleeting, but victory in the mind, that lasted generations. And so, the Lion of Egypt began his quietest, darkest war, the war for obedience. It began with the Watchers. From the borders of Armenia to the harbors of Alexandria, from the caravan routes of Damascus to the spice markets of Cairo, he spun a network invisible to the naked eye. Merchants, clerics, scribes, slaves, all became the eyes and ears of the throne. Letters moved faster than armies, carried by horsemen and pigeons alike, inked in codes only Baybars' inner circle could decipher. Every rumor was collected, every conversation dissected. An insult whispered in the alleys of Aleppo could reach Cairo before the man who spoke it finished his wine. The Sultan did not need to watch his enemies. He made the world watch itself. To ensure loyalty, Baybars turned fear into theater. Every Friday after prayer, the people of Cairo would gather in the courtyards of the citadel. The imam's sermon would end, the crowd would murmur, and then the executioner would appear. Traitors, thieves, and conspirators were paraded before the people, their crimes read aloud not as accusations but as warnings. The condemned were beheaded with such precision that the crowd often gasped not at the blood, but at the silence that followed. Baybars rarely attended these rituals in person. He didn't need to. His absence made the spectacle even more powerful. It told his subjects that justice did not depend on his presence, it was his presence. Even unseen he ruled. Every oath sworn, every prayer uttered, every public act of loyalty was performed under the shadow of that understanding. The Sultan sees. The Sultan knows. And in time, people began to believe that God himself watched through Baybars' eyes. He wove religion into the architecture of obedience. New mosques rose across his realm, magnificent, austere, unyielding. Each was built with the same blueprint: a pulpit for the imam, a niche facing Mecca, and a hidden alcove for the Sultan's spies. The Friday prayers became surveillance rituals, where imams measured the crowd's reactions, noted the hesitant voices and reported them up the chain. Faith was no longer a refuge, it was the mirror in which the state examined its soul. Baybars' genius lay not in cruelty alone, but in its precision. He understood that terror must be ritualized, not random but sacred. Each execution was followed by charity, each purge by a sermon. He fed the poor, funded scholars, and restored holy sites even as he tightened his grip around every throat. In him, mercy and fear became indistinguishable, two faces of the same divine justice. Beyond his borders, Baybars extended his shadow with diplomacy sharp as a dagger's edge. He wrote letters to Byzantine emperors in polished Greek, addressing them as brothers in civilization, while reminding them, subtly, of what happened to those who defied him. He sent gifts of gold and falcons to Mongol khans, wrapped in flowery pledges of peace, even as he quietly stirred rebellion among their vassals. And to the merchants of Venice and Genoa, he offered treaties dripping with profit, so long as their ships carried more trade than soldiers. Every deal was a weapon. Every treaty a test. The world believed Baybars ruled from his throne in Cairo. In truth, he ruled from the shadows of other men's ambitions. He made allies of his enemies, enemies of his allies, and slaves of both. His empire was not one of gold or conquest, but of whispers, a living organism that fed on fear, secrecy, and ritual. No one dared speak his name above a whisper, yet his image was everywhere, on coins, in prayers, carved into the marble of mosques. He became more than a ruler, he became an idea. And ideas, once born, cannot be assassinated. But there is a curse in the architecture of power. The higher it rises, the deeper its foundations rot. Baybars' spies began to spy on one another. His generals, once bound by loyalty, grew weary of living beneath perpetual suspicion. The same fear that kept his empire upright began to turn inward, feeding on itself. Informants vanished. Reports contradicted each other. The machine that had devoured conspiracies now began to invent them. Even Baybars, sharp, calculating, untouchable, began to feel the chill of his own design. He trusted no one, dined alone, and often changed chambers at night. He ordered food from multiple kitchens, water from separate wells, each tested by tasters who rarely survived the year. He slept with a dagger beneath his pillow and a letter under his hand, a letter that none would ever see. Some said it was his confession. Others believed it was a list of every man he still planned to destroy. And yet, for all his darkness, Baybars brought stability to a world that had forgotten what peace felt like. Trade flourished, caravans crossed the deserts without fear, scholars wrote, children grew up under a sky no longer filled with arrows. The price of that peace was silence. And in that silence his empire prospered. Historians would later call it the Empire of Shadows, a realm that lived not in the light of faith or law, but in the half-light of obedience. It was both magnificent and monstrous, both order and suffocation. A world where every prayer was a confession, and every confession was a chain. And as the years passed, Baybars' face became legend, carved on walls, recited in stories, invoked by rulers who came after him. But behind the legend lay a truth too dark for most to speak. Every empire, no matter how brilliant, eventually begins to consume its own children. And Baybars, the Lion of Egypt, was feeding the beast he had built. You've just walked through an empire that breathed through secrets and ruled through silence. If you can emerge from that darkness and still not subscribe, then maybe you, too, prefer the comfort of the shadows. But if you believe stories like this deserve to be seen not buried, then subscribe to Tale of History, where the ghosts of power still whisper and the silence still bleeds. By the final decade of his reign, Baybars had become both myth and man, a contradiction carved into the very bones of his empire. The people called him Al-Zahir, the victorious, the defender of the faith. But in the silent halls of his palace, where the scent of ink and blood mingled like incense, he was something else entirely. He was a man who had learned to kneel before God by day and whisper to demons by night. At dawn, the Sultan prayed with a devotion that silenced entire mosques. He bowed low, his forehead pressed to the cold marble floor, lips moving in a rhythm older than memory. He fasted through the heat, gave alms to the poor, and built fountains for travelers who would never know his name. He commissioned Qurans written in gold leaf, mosques that touched the clouds, libraries that glowed with the words of scholars. He appeared every inch the holy monarch chosen by heaven, protector of the faithful. But when the sun fell and the prayers faded, the mask of faith slipped. The same man who washed his hands before prayer washed them again after signing death warrants. The same voice that recited the verses of mercy ordered the slow torture of spies and dissidents. By night, he plotted the movements of armies, the ruin of rivals, the next purge to keep his empire breathing. He was tireless, relentless, a man convinced that God had entrusted him not with peace, but with control. And in his conviction, every cruelty became sanctified. He spoke of justice, yet his courts echoed with fear. He preached humility, yet demanded prostration deeper than prayer. He fed the poor, but with the same hand that had taken their fathers for his army. His generosity dazzled, his wrath terrified. And both, together, created the illusion of divine balance. To his scholars he was a patron beyond compare. He funded theologians who called him the sword of God, historians who painted his campaigns as miracles. They filled the libraries of Cairo and Damascus with treatises praising his wisdom, his restraint, his unshakable faith. But beneath the ink of those manuscripts lay another truth, one the writers dared not write. That his piety was not love of God, but fear of emptiness. He built sanctuaries not to find peace, but to keep his own demons from echoing too loudly in the silence. At times he seemed almost haunted by his success. He would rise from prayer and walk alone through the courtyards of his palaces, vast, echoing spaces where every footstep reminded him how far he had come from the boy sold in the markets of Crimea. The night air carried the songs of the muezzins, soft and distant, but to him they sounded like a chorus of ghosts. The faces of the fallen Crusaders, the Mongols, the rivals he had poisoned, even Qutuz, they followed him like a shadow. And though he ruled as the Lion of Egypt, he often looked less like a lion and more like a man forever listening for footsteps behind him. He tried to drown that silence with building, with grandeur, with permanence. The mosques he raised across the Levant were not monuments to God, but to order. Every arch, every dome, every minaret was a statement. This will stand when I am gone. But even in their beauty there was menace. The walls were too tall, the halls too still, the inscriptions too perfect. It was as if he hoped to trap eternity inside them, and silence it forever. The people adored him and feared him in equal measure. Mothers blessed his name as their sons joined his army. Traders praised his roads even as his taxes crushed them. The poor whispered that he was sent by God, the rich whispered that he was God's punishment. And Baybars himself no longer seemed to know the difference. In the end, his faith became a mask he wore so long that it fused to his face. He prayed with sincerity, but his sincerity was built on control. He believed in divine justice, but only as long as he was the one delivering it. When the Imam spoke of humility, he smiled and nodded, knowing that humility was a luxury only the powerless could afford. The contradiction was complete. The Sultan who had risen from chains to command the world's mightiest army now lived shackled by his own empire. He could not rest, could not trust, could not confess. His throne was his cage, his crown, a weight pressing slowly into his soul. And yet, to his people he was the model of righteousness. They saw the mosques, not the prisons, the sermons, not the screams. To them, his reign was the golden age of Islam reborn, the world restored from chaos by the hand of a man who feared no mortal and served no master but God. But history, that cold and merciless witness, tells a darker truth. That Baybars' faith was not the kind that saves men's souls. It was the kind that hides their sins. His empire glittered like sunlight on a blade, holy from afar, but deadly up close. And as age crept upon him, the Lion of Egypt began to wonder whether the God he had served so faithfully still recognized him. He had spoken of submission all his life, but had he ever truly bowed? Or had he merely replaced one master with another, his will for God's? That question lingered in his last years, unspoken, unanswered. For every ruler who lives long enough must one day stand before his own reflection, and Baybars, the slave who became sultan, saw not a savior nor a tyrant, but something far more human. A man who mistook his fear for faith, and his ambition for destiny. By the time the sun began to set on Baybars' reign, the empire he had built no longer needed his hand to move, it moved by habit, by fear, by memory. It was an empire of reflex and ritual, too vast for one man to hold, too cruel to sustain peace without him. And at its center, the Sultan himself, older now, his beard silvered, his voice quieter but heavier, sat alone beneath ceilings he once raised to the glory of God. The Lion of Egypt was aging, and lions do not age gracefully. In his final years, the whisper of betrayal became his nightly prayer. Every ally looked like an assassin. Every servant a spy. Even his Mamluks, his brothers in arms, his army of slaves who owed their freedom to him, began to sense the rot. The same machine he had built to see everything now watched him, and the fear he had sown in others began to return home. The chronicles speak of purges that swept through Cairo like invisible plagues. Emirs accused of disloyalty vanished into the dungeons beneath the citadel. Officers were executed for hesitation, advisors replaced with men too afraid to speak. At the feasts of Ramadan, laughter grew thin, eyes darted from face to face, wondering which smile hid the next betrayal. Even the sound of a dropped cup could silence the hall. Baybars still ruled, but his rule had turned inward, consuming its own reflection. He trusted no one. Not his generals, not his scribes, not the imams who blessed his name. He moved his bedchamber nightly, never sleeping twice in the same place. He drank only from cups poured before his eyes. And yet, even as the walls closed around him, he could not stop building new ones. He expanded his palaces, ordered new fortifications, restructured his armies, as though trying to outrun the inevitability of his own decay. There are stories, whispered by those who served closest to him, that in his last months, the Sultan began to speak to no one but himself. He would rise before dawn, pray alone, and then stand for hours staring at the horizon, where the desert met the sky. Perhaps he saw ghosts there, Qutuz, the Sultan he had murdered, Kipchak, the Mongol general whose skull had marked his victory, the nameless men who had built his empire and died before they could see it. Every conqueror eventually becomes the prisoner of his own triumph. Baybars had caged the world, and now found himself pacing inside it. Then the end came quietly, too quietly for a man whose life had roared so loudly. It began with a feast. A celebration in Damascus, where Baybars met with his commanders after returning from yet another campaign in the north. The table was lavish: roasted lamb, fruit, and a bowl of sherbet, sweetened with rosewater and ice. He drank from it, and moments later his face paled. The accounts diverge here. Some say the poison struck swiftly, that the lion collapsed before the cup hit the floor. Others say it was slower, a fever over several days, his body writhing under the weight of divine justice. One chronicler wrote that he called for water, but none dared approach him, fearing the wrath of touching a dying king. Another swore he smiled as he died, whispering something only the dead would understand. Even poison kneels before power. There are theories, of course, endless and contradictory. Some claim it was an assassination, orchestrated by his own Mamluks weary of living under his shadow. Others, that it was divine punishment, a reckoning for the arrogance that made him believe he could wield faith like a weapon. And there are those who insist it was nothing more than accident, a cup of poisoned sherbet meant for another, taken by fate's cold indifference. Whatever the truth, his death left Egypt in a silence thicker than grief. No one celebrated. No one dared mourn too loudly. The throne stood empty for days as the emirs argued in whispers about who would take his place. The empire he had built, bound by fear and brilliance, began to turn on itself. The machine that had once crushed enemies now devoured its own creators. Loyalty fractured into factions, brothers into rivals, soldiers into scavengers of authority. The Mamluk state, born from slavery, now stood as the master of the Muslim world, and yet, without Baybars, it trembled like a beast that had lost its head. His successors inherited his system but not his vision. They imitated his cruelty but not his control. And one by one, they fell to the same blades they wielded, repeating the same cycle of betrayal he had once perfected. In time his monuments faded. The gold he offered to mosques dulled with dust. The walls he built cracked under centuries of sand. But his name endured, not as a saint, nor as a tyrant, but as a paradox. The slave who rose to kingship. The believer who ruled through fear. The savior who died by his own design. In Cairo they say his throne was left untouched for a month after his death. No one dared sit upon it. It was said that those who tried felt their hearts stop, that the ghost of the lion guarded it still, unseen, unmerciful. Eventually a new sultan claimed it. But by then the metal had begun to rust. The slave's crown, once polished by the blood of empires, now corroded in the air of his absence. And with it faded the illusion that any man, no matter how divine, how feared, or how victorious, could ever rule without being ruled by something darker. In the silence that followed, Egypt exhaled. The storm had passed. But its echo, the memory of the man who turned chains into kingdoms, would haunt history forever. You followed him from captivity to conquest, from prayer to poison. If you can witness a slave's rise and fall, and still not subscribe, maybe history itself no longer stirs you. But if the echo of his crown still rings in your mind, then join Tale of History, where even the dead still speak through the dust of their empires.